All right, now, I said I was going to get this done before Pride Month, and god damn it, we got 4 hours until Pride Month ends, and I'm going to post the shit. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. We're going to do it. We're doing it. We're doing it. Let's aims to redefine sainthood by elevating queer icons to spiritual rock stars. Catholic saints, long suspected of being queer, are explored archetypically and highlighted for their patronage of queer identities and communities. This book is mostly a compendium of queer saints following a similar format: name, patronage, blurb about their relationship to queerness, a spell or a ritual, and some magical associations, usually an offering and a tarot. In between the list of saints, the author takes time to define and redefine two core concepts: sainthood and queerness, examining the fluidity of both by drawing upon pop culture figures that feel contemporary to the readers. I was sent this book by Wiser. The author is, as time of posting, my mutual on Instagram and TikTok. I do have a personal bias in favor of the book and a professional obligation to talk about it. While we're on the subject, authors, publishers, please start sending me audiobooks in addition to physical copies. At this point, if y'all want me to get a chance to read your book and put out a review in a timely manner, an ADHD bitch is going to need some accommodations. Still within this preamble section, let me just say, I understand how important it is that this book simply exists. The simple fact that a book titled Queer Saints exists and is sold in major retailers is undeniably important. The vast majority of reviews of this book have almost exclusively praised the text for the information conveyed by the title alone. I find the uncritical promotion of a book to be disrespectful to the author's time. If you claim to be creating a revolutionary discussion on such dense subjects as queerness and sainthood, you deserve an equally revolutionary response. Let's dive into the review of the book. I want to present the ideas of sainthood and queerness through my understanding of their presentation in the book. I've grouped together chapters based on content, so we are going to be jumping around a lot. Obviously, spoilers are ahead. If you are into pop culture magic or just want to have your own experience of queer saints, please pause, read the book, and then come back after. Sainthood is initially described as rooted in religiosity and gender norms. This straw man is refuted by presenting 5 misconceptions about sainthood. Number 1, saints are morally good and altruistic. Number 2, saints never say no. Number 3, saints are accepting of theirs and others' abuse. Number 4, saints are willing subjects to authority, absent of uniqueness or autonomy. And number 5, saints are universally forgiving. These are places like 5 things or common perceptions about saints the author refutes or sees as misconceptions. Pagliarulo offers a secret 6th misconception that saints reject the flesh, seeing bodily pleasure or physical existence as a barrier to emulating the divine or a misuse of their vessel. These 6 ideas are held as widespread misinformation campaigns. The author continues by rejecting the idea of saintly perfection rooted in piety, righteousness, and chastity. Succinctly, the author rejects the idea that saints are, quote, pure in thought and deed and way of life. There's an odd deviation at this point in the book to talk about Saint Carlo Actius, or like the millennial saint. The author takes the time to pontificate about the material and sexual desires of this 15-year-old saint, in theory to drive the point that the physical experience of living is inseparable from the attainment of sainthood. More so, Pagliarulo seems to suggest that the vast majority of believers can't grasp the nuance of being horny and holy at the same time. At this point in the book, we start to explore sainthood through contrasting archetypes by highlighting a holy figure who held both identities, or at least fits the mold based on their perception currently. The first example is Mary Magdalene being a sex worker and the favored apostle. a widely held belief that is thankfully refuted in the text. St. Mary Magdalene is repackaged as a divine feminine figure who relates to queerness via forced marginalization and her patronage over sex work. Similarly, the text explores saints as activists and witches, highlighting figures like Saint Pierre Gregorio and Marie Laveau, respectively. One to combat the perception of passivity among saints, and the latter to highlight the diversity of spiritual practice among saintly figures. Pagliarulo pushes the idea that saints, and especially queer saints, do not originate in Christianity, providing examples of sainthood as viewed by early Jesus peoples, Judaism, and
Muslimanity?
No,
When I think
Islam.
Ultimately segueing to his point that queer-coded saints have always existed. Functionally, queer is redefined as doing something radical or against cultural norms. Through this lens, we explore the stories of 5 saints. I'm only going to cover 3. The first is Saint Francis of Assisi, then the Madonna of Montevergine, Hildegard von Bingen, Saint Sebastian, and Joan of Arc. Joan! The initial description of Saint Francis is as mother, brother, and gender bender, which I think is more for shock value than ethnicity. The only reference I found to Saint Francis calling himself mother was in a letter to all the faithful, in which he said, "The Spirit of the Lord will rest on all who live in this way and preserve it into the end. He will permanently dwell in them, and they will be the Father's children who do this work. They are the spouses, brothers, and mothers of our Lord Jesus Christ." This letter is radically different across sources, so I'm not really sure where the original quote from or like who has the original letter. You can compare the source I pulled this quote from to the version held by the Vatican's digital archives in the description. The idea of all Christians being the mother of Christ is strongly echoed in St. Louis de Montfort's consecration to Mary and serves as a core ideology of Mariology. In a sort of concentric nature, when we accept Christ, we become Christ, being held in the womb of Mary. Simultaneously, we become Mary holding Christ within us. This kind of gender fluidity is quite foundational to Christianity. In the book After Jesus, Before Christianity, early Jesus peoples and their absence or intentional subversion of gender norms is highlighted. I question the historical and theological responsibility of the author in retroactively applying modern queer identities to historical figures. Rather than focusing on the inherent centrality of Christian androgyny, the book seems to focus more on the story of St. Francis stripping his clothes as sympathetic evidence for the radical act of stripping himself of his wealth, power, and status. There's the idea that Francis is the ultimate outsider, which is drawn from the author Donald L. Boisvert in his book Sanctity and Male Desire. The unspoken conclusion seems to be that queerness is relative to societal norms. Francis, if born 1,000 years earlier, is at home in his androgynous love of God, yet because of the gender norms of his time is framed as queer-coded. Whether a Marian apparition counts as a saint is debatable, but we can ignore that for now. Her inclusion seems to reinforce the idea that God or the divine has an unconditional love of humanity, which includes queer people. More so, the marginalized receive a special, equitable patronage from the divine. Saint Hildegard von Bingen is next. She's included as a queer saint for her, quote, nearly unimaginable abundance of creativity. She's the first saint included for whom we have actual like speculative evidence of holding what we can now call a queer identity. Despite the alleged love she had for her secretary and the desperate sadness she wrote about when said secretary became the abbess of another abbey, Pagliarulo attributes Bingen's queerness to her, quote, life of sacred rebellion. The second half of this chapter is a lot more speculative. We go through saints a little more rapid fire, retrospectively adding modern queer identities to these historical figures, like Saints Felicity and Perpetua as early lesbian figures. In an interview with WNYC, Pagliarulo defines saints as people who have passed over, who have done revolutionary things in life, people who we call in intercession. He colors his experience of traditional saint petitioning as a process of supplication and self-diminishment. The claim is that you have to prove yourself worthy to earn a saint's favor. The author juxtaposes the self-determination of his petitioning process, called modern intercession, contrasting primarily the practitioner's sense of self-worth. There's a pivot from needing to prove your case to a saint via evidence and supplication to being inherently entitled to help just because you asked. The gag is that's kind of how saints have always worked. The perceived need to prove yourself or your case to saints is not a spiritual process that's internal to Catholicism and is more indicative of individual understandings or perhaps even misunderstandings of core doctrines. While I'll admit it is a widespread misunderstanding, supplication is not something that's inherently given to the saints. In fact, within the strictest of Catholic contexts, it is rather blasphemous and sort of crosses the line into paganism. But you're talking to a witch, I don't give a shit. Fascinating contradiction on this page here, page 60. The second paragraph talks about how the supplication process is effective. Quote, I grew up hearing countless stories of how saints had aided in miracles, end quote. Only for the effectiveness of supplication to be rejected 4 paragraphs later. Quote, the most common method still utilizes supplication as the main ingredient, and there's a good reason it doesn't work. It's confusing to tell us how the saints have healed bodies or mended relationships, only to then tell us this method of supplication doesn't work. One of the most interesting questions the author asks feels completely ignored by the rest of the text, at least to me. That is, quote, where is the holiness in being made to feel less than you are? Which you can argue is sort of the ultimate question of the book. I've kind of touched on this idea already, but the book consistently pushes the idea that it's offering a brand new and radical approach to saint magic called modern intercession or modern intervention or intercession, one of the two. This modern intervention is framed by comparing the author's experience with traditional saint petitioning. So maybe the best way to review this is by very quickly comparing them as they're compared in the book. Traditional saint magic is defined by the author as inherently demeaning, requiring supplication, having rigid protocol, requiring humility of the petitioner. Saints provide intercession, not miracles. The saints or this style of petitioning demands meaningless sacrifice, like the giving up of your favorite candy bar. It also demands you to be in suffering or demands your suffering as sort of a prerequisite to being heard. It is described as a desperate devotion and requires the petitioner to dive into a pit of unworthiness. That is a direct quote. It is also described as more need-based, that it is rooted in absence or loss or necessity, rather than the more high vibrational method of modern intercession. Continuing, modern intercession is described actually less comparatively in this one section, at least. It's described as self-empowering, vibratory, specifically in this like high vibes only, you attract what you are, the secret-esque type thing. It is considered flexible. It focuses on your entitlement to assistance and really reframes you as being, as the text describes it, worthy of like saintly or divine help. It is also very body-centric or sensual, focusing on not denying our human experience, but integrating that into the magical and spiritual process. We've defined the practice's parameters, but let's dive into the book's actual process. The book spends a lot of time explaining that you should petition saints while in a confident and clear state to get results. We're reminded over and over that begging for help is seen as ineffective and demeaning in the author's perspective. Pleading for saintly intercession is compared to bodily exhaustion in a barren landscape. The idea is you can't really push yourself physically by pushing yourself spiritually. Having established that this is a good vibes only process, the author says that the starting place for magic is within the practitioner. Through a process coined as illuminating your inner altar, Pagliarulo aims to guide the reader into finding and strengthening a sort of inner spiritual world. The actual steps prescribed in the text are very New Agey and obviously rooted in Dharmic traditions. Pagliarulo instructs us to maintain an erect spine, to sit comfortably, and to begin pranayama breathing. You may know it more as box breathing. It's inhaling, holding, exhaling, holding, and repeating, usually an odd number of times, like 3. This was really like massively appropriated in the early 2000s, especially when Navy SEALs began to share this technique with the masses and fitness influencers started to get really popular. The reader is instructed to visualize a purple light transforming into a white light like a flash of lightning. The reader is then instructed to focus on their third eye, even going so far as to lightly touch or rub it to activate the energy. We're then led through a pretty typical series of hypnosis prompts, like the mostly blank canvas you're invited to fill in. In this case, that mostly blank canvas is a green field. Eventually, we're expected to visualize a cottage and to ultimately enter it. Within this cottage is the inner altar. We're encouraged to imagine it as whatever works with us. The author describes a dark wooden table. Upon this altar, we're encouraged to imagine a candle, and with a beam of white light from our third eye, we're meant to ignite the wick on the candle. Pagliarulo suggests leaving the vision at this point, exiting the cottage and leaving the candle illuminated. The idea is that the space will remain spiritually activated and thus potently prepared for future magic. It's implied that we should return here every time we do spell work, doing magic either exclusively in this realm or amplifying our physical workings in this spiritual space. The last thing I want to touch on here are some additional rules for modern intercession. This magic is transactional, requiring offerings for the spirit's successful intercession. It's suggested that an offering should have more cultural or communal impact than flowers on the altar, though that is also suggested. Ideally donating to charities or speaking publicly about your saint. As far as magical techniques, there are really only 3 in this book, at least described in this context. Some of the individual saints have more unique spells or prayer petitions prescribed to them. Those 3 are a candle spell, a petition, and a sachet. Pretty basic folk magic stuff. Something that doesn't sit right with me is the mixing of traditions. Inconsistencies arise from the blending of folk Catholicism with Eastern traditions without proper authority. The author frequently nods to the concept of sainthood in Buddhism without any indication of a deep understanding of the differences or the academic authority to truly compare the two. There's also no specific mention of which path of Buddhism we're talking about. All right. Well, my camera's no longer working, so the rest of this is a podcast. Congratulations. Please go clean your kitchen while you listen to me babble. Continuing. Yogic breathing techniques and chakras are appropriated to flesh out the meditation and magic practice. There's not an obvious discussion on where these techniques come from or why they belong in a book about queer folk Catholic magic. I always hope the actual magical techniques would be less new age and cookie cutter, but I think it's easier to market and to digest. It's something most readers are uncritically open to integrating into their lives. According to Pagliarulo, modern queer sainthood is defined by 5 parameters. Number 1, they're dead and weren't dicks in life. Number 2, they are communal, interdependent, and inspirational. Number 3, they sought authenticity and integrity. Number 4, they are canonized by the people, not the church. And number 5, they have made miracles in the human heart, soul, and mind. The rest of the book, and the majority by page count, is a compendium of pop culture figures the author canonizes as queer saints. A lot of them are quite deserving of the title, having fought for civil rights or making meaningful impacts on queer communities. There seems to be a very loose adherence to the previously defined queer sainthood parameters. I find myself sincerely wishing this book were exclusively a compendium, or at least a comparium primarily. I think that's where the real heart of this book is. I see the author's love of magic and his community most prominently in this compendium section. The effort, the research, the time, the interviews it took to flesh out the magic, the tarot associations, the offerings, the histories, and the feast days for all these saints is extremely impressive, and the most attractive and probably the exclusively useful to me aspect of this book. It is almost exclusively helpful to me as a reference for prominently, I don't want to say entirely queer figures, because a lot of them are queer allies. There's also some unfortunate focus held on some over others. For example, Marsha P. Johnson gets a paragraph between Larry Kramer and Marlene Dietrich. Just fine. Summing it up. Honestly, I'd give this book a 5 out of 10 overall. It's not the worst book I read, but it's not the revolution I expected based on the title and the marketing around it. I hope that future books will be more internally consistent and more interested in showcasing a deeply rooted practice rather than something with more mass appeal. I will say, I am not the target audience for the book, despite all evidence to the contrary. I don't resonate with pop culture witchcraft. I don't like the uncritical applications of chakras and magical practices, and I'm not learning how to interact with my own spiritual inner world. I can be kind of a bitch. I'll admit that. When Miss Mary J. Blige was talking about hateration, she was talking about me. Despite that, I went in with an open heart and optimistic eyes. I encourage you to do the same as you read Queer Saints by Antonio Pagliarulo. Once again, thank you to Wiser for sending me a free copy. Please attach an audiobook link in the future. Thank you. If you have read Queer Saints, and I do mean read it, not just picked it up and bought it, but read it, bitch. Tell me what you thought in the comments. Did you love it? Was it everything you wanted and more? Was it truly the bag of chips it described itself as? Let me know. I'm fascinated by your perspective and totally recognize that my voice is one in a sea of many. So please tell me what you think. Absolutely comment down below. What do you think I was too harsh about? What do you think I left on the table? And what could I have talked more about? That's all I have for you guys. You can't see it, but I'm making the sign of the cross at the camera, so do it with me. It is peace I offer you. It is in peace I leave you. Have a wonderful day.